Good afternoon. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this workshop, we bring in scholars from across the country to present their research and to have a discussion with the NDSU community. And I'm really excited that today we're going to be joined by Dr. Brad Wilcox. In this series, our speakers present on topics of innovation, opportunity, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. So Dr. W. Bradford Wilcox is a professor of sociology and the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. His research is focused on marriage, fatherhood, and cohabitation, especially on ways that family structure, civil society, and culture influence the quality and stability of family life in the United States and around the globe. Currently, he's exploring the contribution that families make to the economic welfare of individuals and societies. He is also a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He received his PhD in sociology from Princeton University. And after his presentation, there will be time for you to ask your own questions, so please get your questions ready. There's also going to be food in the atrium afterwards, so please stay around and join us for food. And without any further delay, let's welcome Dr. Brad Wilcox. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, John, and thanks to Clay and everyone else at the Challey Institute for making our time together possible. So I want to begin by kind of turning the clock back 21 years and talking about something that happened 21 years ago. So on a warm spring day in 2000, a who's who audience of lawmakers, lobbyists, Hill staffers, I'm just trying to get this, it's not going here. There we go. Lawmakers, lobbyists, Hill staffers, and academics gathered on Think Tank Row in Washington, D.C. to hear President Bill Clinton deliver a ringing endorsement of the China trade bill. Now, the president gave a typically Clintonian, by which I mean effusive and extravagant, endorsement of the bill, full of promises about the goods that would come from normalizing free trade with China. Trade with China would advance, in his words, economic freedom, would have a profound impact on human rights and political liberty. And most importantly for his domestic audience, would foster a, quote, future of greater prosperity for the American people. Now, virtually all of the smart people of that time, from the editors of the Wall Street Journal to fellows at the Brookings Institution, bought the president's promises. So too did senior politicians on both sides of the aisle, including then Senator Joe Biden. As we kind of look back on all of this, I think we could sort of agree that Clinton's promises ring hollow. There was no flowering of freedom in China, political, religious, or technological. And his promise of a future of greater prosperity for the American people, too, I think, fell flat. Now, to be clear, there is no question that expanding trade with China enriched many of the kinds of elites who assembled before Clinton on that warm spring day in Washington. It also brought countless cheap goods, from sneakers, you can think about Nike, to smartphones, you can think about Apple, to our shores. But the idea that a dramatic expansion in free trade with China would bring greater prosperity for the American people would come as a rude surprise to millions of Americans across the Midwest and Southeast. And that's because the China trade deal struck by Clinton, Biden, and the Washington establishment led to what's been called since then the China trade shock. And this trade shock, according to the work of the MIT economist David Autor and his colleagues, led to more than 2 million Americans being thrown out of work across the Midwest and Southeast especially. And the toll on these workers and their families was devastating. Autor and his colleagues found that the shock had, quote, particularly negative impacts on the labor market prospects of men, unquote, eliminating countless jobs and, quote, diminishing their relative earnings, unquote. Now, what this means kind of in plain language is that millions of men lost ground as providers. And because men who are not stably employed in decent paying jobs are less attractive as potential husbands and more likely to land in divorce court, this led to less marriage and to more single parenthood. So what happened here then is that more trade with China meant less marriage, fewer kids, and a dwindling prospect of attaining the American dream for millions of working and middle-class families across the United States. So I think this is kind of one example of how our ruling class, in this case, both Republican and Democratic, has ended up often failing American families, particularly working class, middle class families. And this kind of, in this particular instance, flows in part from what Orrin Cass has called a kind of free market fundamentalism. Now, it's true, and we must obviously acknowledge that the free trade and the market have played an important role in fueling economic growth, both here and abroad. But many, I think, on the right and the center did not kind of see the downside of free trade in this case, did not see how their kind of commitment to a laissez-faire ideology would exact a kind of terrible toll on scores of working class families across the United States. So this kind of free market fundamentalism, if you will, is but one example then of how, particularly in this case, Republicans and centrists, the Democratic Party, have made decisions that have eviscerated the economic and the social foundations of family life for working and middle-class Americans. And as you kind of think about this issue more broadly, that is sort of family life more broadly, my claim today is that in recent decades, government and corporate leaders have made choices on trade, technology, education, and welfare that have often benefited their own economic or social standing, but have undercut family life for ordinary Americans. And too often, it's been precisely the American families that can least afford it that have paid the biggest price for our elite's bad decisions. So, what am I talking about in terms of like, what's the problem here that I'm concerned about? How is it the case that we could sort of think about kind of family life in America facing, serious problems or serious difficulties? So I've got a couple of slides to kind of give you a sense of the story. And the first slide here coming up is basically showing you how, since the 1970s, marriage has been in retreat. And so from, Republican administrations like Ronald Reagan to Democratic administrations like Bill Clinton, we can see kind of that marriage is less likely in recent decades to kind of ground and guide American families. So that's kind of one point to think about. And then in more recent years, really in both the Obama and in the Trump administrations, we've seen fertility now in the US heading to record lows. So last year, the total fertility rate was about 1.64 babies per woman, which means that sort of the average American woman would have about 1.6 kids. And that is a record low in our country. And I think we're going to see kind of this rate come down even more in the coming years. We've also seen, as a consequence of these kinds of shifts, that today about 1 in 2 of our kids are being raised outside of an intact married family. So again, about 50% of kids in the country today are being raised outside of a home with their own 2 parents. And this kind of retreat from marriage, this growing family instability that we're seeing across the US, does not kind of hit all Americans equally. What the next slide shows us is that particularly really since the 1990s, in the last 30 years, we've seen a growing share of working class and middle class kids being raised apart from both of their parents. So again, family life is changing in America is part of the story here in the direction of less marriage and less fertility. And it's also kind of changing in ways that have a disparate impact on poor, and especially in recent years, working and middle class Americans. So that's sort of the concern that I'm kind of thinking about today. And again, my claim here is that in different ways, Republicans and Democrats and the ruling class more generally has kind of, I think, borne some important responsibility for these kinds of trends. So again, the ruling class has kind of let the educational, the economic, and the cultural foundations of strong and stable families crumble in recent years. And to kind of illustrate the point here, we can kind of think about three different sets of failures on the part of our government, even really our corporate elites too, in some important ways. So the first, I think, concern that I want to talk about is the fact that growing numbers of men in our country are out of work, okay? So the percent of men in their prime working years, that's sort of 25 to 54, who are not working full time, has more than doubled from 8% in 1970 to 19% in 2019. And my colleague at AEI, Nicholas Everson, has written a book on this called Men Out of Work. And in that book, he points out the trend you can kind of see behind me. And that is that these sort of trends have been concentrated among men who do not have college degrees, okay? So men from often kind of more lower middle class, working class, and poor backgrounds are the men who are most likely today to not be kind of stably connected to the labor force. So why is it that so many men are kind of floundering on a variety of fronts, but particularly here we can see kind of on the jobs front? Well, what I would suggest to you today is that part of the story here is about the way in which we could call kind of big education, by which I mean our schools, our colleges, our universities, are not serving our boys and young men well. They've done kind of a bad job in recent decades of educating males. The pedagogy, the substance, and the ethos found in too many of our schools is helping to fuel a widening gap between male and female performance in our schools, in our colleges, and in our universities. We can see here on the data mentioned here that boys, for instance, are about twice as likely to be expelled from schools today. We can see that about 39% of young men are enrolling in our colleges compared to 49% of young women. And what we can see also too is that the educational sector devotes a lot more sort of time, attention, prestige, and money to kids on the college track than it does to kids on different tracks. And, you know, as we can see here as well, boys and young men are less likely to be on that college track. So the bottom line here is that big education is failing to equip too many young men with the kind of education they need to build useful job skills, develop a sense of achievement, and get on a path to decent paying, stable jobs. Okay, so that's, I think, part of the challenge facing us when it comes to men and work. A second kind of, I think, set of challenges that kind of go together is the way in which public policy and big tech are discouraging, in some ways, young men and even middle-aged men from working. Okay, so on the governmental policy side, what we're seeing is that big government is kind of rewarding idleness and penalizing work for a decent number of men in their prime working years, as the share of men ages 25 to 54 who are in government disability has more than doubled. Now, of course, many of these men have legitimate mental or medical problems that keep them from work, but the share of prime age men on disability has been surging even as the physical conditions of work have gotten relatively easier in America, which suggests that some men on assistance don't need it. And what's also frustrating is the system is set up so that going back to full-time work is often a worse deal financially for men than just remaining on disability and collecting a government check. And I think this problem is being augmented also by the way in which big tech today is offering increasingly alluring, what I call electronic opiates, from Xbox to OnlyFans, that in a sense distract adolescent and young males from engaging to the fullest in their schools and in their workplaces. Okay, so this might be a kind of claim that would be, you might be skeptical about, but what we've seen from work done by the Princeton economist Mark Aguirre and his team is they found that recreational computer time has surged 60% for young men ages 21 to 30 from 2004 to 2017. Okay, so kind of the idea that guys are spending more and more time, and teenage males more and more time on things like Xbox is sort of being chronicled by him. And then he also finds that about half of the decline, or almost half of the decline, in work for men in their 20s over the same period can be explained by their kind of a connection to gaming, or what I'm calling kind of electronic opioids, okay? Now, this, I think, problem, and if you're the parent of a boy in the basement, you probably know kind of what I'm talking about here, but this problem, I worry, may get even worse as the quality of our technology in this department improves even more. And we know, for instance, that Mark Zuckerberg just released a video this week talking about kind of the next thing, the more immersive technology, which I think he's going to call Meta or Metaverse, coming out from his company. Do you want to just maybe show about a minute of this new technology that kind of gives us, again, a kind of taste of the electronic story here? So again, we're going to have headsets. People are going to be able to kind of go into physical worlds, and they're going to go into new social worlds through this new technology that are much more compelling, much more distracting, much more engrossing than what we already have, on offer to our young adults, as this, again, this video kind of gives us a taste of. And so my concern here is that some share, and obviously there'll be a minority, but some share of both young women and especially young men will be even less connected to education and to the workplace as these kind of electronic opiates become even more compelling in kind of capturing their attention, their imagination, and their time. That's the concern here. Okay, we can go to the next slide, back off of this video. So when you put these kinds of trends together, what you're seeing again is that fewer and fewer young men in our culture, and even middle-aged men in our culture, are being connected to full-time employment. And this brings us back to kind of the family angle here. That's important, that's consequential, right? Because guys who are not stably employed at decent paying jobs are not particularly attractive as husbands, okay? So they're less likely to get married, as the research here indicates, and they're less likely to stay married, okay? So again, the concern here is that what's happening to men vis-a-vis the labor force is one of the factors driving declines in marriage and elevating family instability as well. So the second thing that I want to mention here is the way in which I think we're kind of seeing the cost of living spiraling upwards for too many working and middle-class Americans, outpacing their ability to afford key aspects of family life. Now, sure, it's true that we have more cheap stuff, TVs beyond our wildest imagination, for instance, but on many major ticket items, things like education, higher education, for instance, and housing, many middle and working class families are frustrated. And this came through in a series of focus groups that the Institute for Family Studies conducted in Ohio, in Georgia, and Texas with white, Black, and Hispanic working class members. So for instance, one Ohio mom said this. She said, "It's been so much harder to maintain a home and home life while having two incomes to complete everything," she said. "Financially, it's become more difficult for families," she said, to kind of do both the work thing and the parenting thing in this new world in terms of kind of keeping up with the living standards. We also heard from many working class Americans, they feel like poor Americans, lower income Americans are receiving government benefits that are not available to them in the middle class. So in the words of one African American mom in the Atlanta area, quote, "It's like we're damned if we do, damned if we don't. If we work, we don't have any type of resources like the poor get," she said. And this view was shared by a married mom in Southern Ohio who said, quote, "I think the middle class is struggling more than lower class because the lower class has so many more opportunities for programs than does the working and the middle classes." Okay. Now, these moms, I think, are actually not off base because work done by Bell Sawhill and Richard Reeves at Brookings indicates that over the last 4 years, middle income households have seen their income rise by only about half of the amount that poor and affluent Americans have experienced, and for different reasons. The poor are benefiting here from the kinds of programs that were just mentioned by our respondents in Ohio and in Georgia. So there's a kind of government-induced, in part, I would suggest to you, middle-class squeeze, where in different ways, big government has driven up the prices for many of the goods most challenging for families in the middle to afford, goods like childcare, education, and housing. We can think, for instance, about the way in which housing costs have outpaced inflation, especially in big metro areas like New York, Los Angeles. We see here as well, San Francisco and Washington. So this would be kind of an example of how government policy has put the squeeze on middle and working class families in kind of our housing markets. But also too, we can see how social welfare policies, from public housing to food stamps, are tailored to help low-income families in ways that have also elicited frustration from our respondents in this working class series of focus group interviews. Then the third thing that I want to mention today is the way in which marriage is often penalized in our public policies. We can think here of Mark and Lisa Payne, who could have stepped in some ways out of a Norman Rockwell portrait. This attractive working class couple live in a modest country home in Central Virginia with two beautiful young daughters who are 4 and 6. He works as a plumber for an HVAC company based in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and she's a stay-at-home mom. Their lives are traditional in many respects, but they're decidedly non-traditional in one important respect, and that is they're not married. And when I asked Mark about this issue, he said, we sat down at the kitchen table and ran the numbers for Medicaid, and they didn't add up. And so what he was talking about is that with his income of about $40,000, if they were to marry, Lisa and the two kids would lose access to their Medicaid insurance, and he doesn't have insurance through his job. So for that reason, they have not gotten married. And they're by no means alone. One Black mother in Atlanta said this. She said, quote, "Yes, I chose not to marry," adding, "I get a lot of assistance from my children, for myself. So if I did marry or put any other type of income in, I would not qualify for anything from the government." Then a University of Virginia graduate student from Arkansas said this to me. He said, quote, "I continue to be amazed by the trajectory difference between my married versus unmarried friends. I keep thinking of my high school classmates who are basically trapped by Medicaid and other income-based programs, never to get married." Okay, so a number of stories kind of illustrate the concern here. And then we kind of look at the research. What we see is that things like Medicaid, child care subsidies, the earned income tax credit are all sort of structured in ways that either kind of lose those benefits or see them dramatically fall off as your income increases. And that practically leads to a marriage penalty, particularly for kind of couples with kids in the kind of $30,000 to $85,000 bracket. And so we can see situations where couples will lose between 10 and 30% of their real household income. And in fact, one study, kind of go back to the Arkansas point, found that a couple with 2 kids in Arkansas lose about 32% of the real income were they to marry. Okay, so these are the kinds of patterns that we're seeing. And there's also research indicating that these penalties are linked to lower rates of marriage, as the bottom part of this slide suggests. Now, part of the tragedy here, to kind of bring in, again, our elites' failures, is that in 1997, Congress took up marriage penalties facing American families in income taxes, okay? And these are sort of penalties that hit American families in basically the upper half of the income distribution in the US. So they addressed their marriage penalties, but they made no effort to address the penalties in means-tested programs that face poor and especially working class families in this country. So this was kind of a major, I think, dereliction of duty, where lawmakers did not give relief to precisely the group that has seen the biggest increase in family instability in the last 3 decades. Okay, so let's think more concretely about each of the two parties vis-a-vis these issues. And we can start with the Republicans. Now, in sort of thinking about Republicans, you can obviously, I think, sort of appreciate or understand that there's kind of no doubt that many Republicans have talked a good game. You know, from Vice President Dan Quayle back in the day talking about Murphy Brown, for those of you who remember that, to Senator Rick Santorum's book on families, there's no question again, the Republicans have kind of led the way in articulating concern about family life in America. But we've seen too much talking from Republicans and not enough walking when it comes to family policy. And the 2017 debate, for instance, over the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, 2017 debate, is illustrative. So Senators Mike Lee and Marco Rubio introduced an amendment at that point that would have made the child tax credit apply to both income and payroll taxes, thereby putting real money in the pockets of millions of working and lower middle class families. Unfortunately, many of their Republican colleagues in 2017 were so focused on delivering a big tax cut for corporate America that they could not bring themselves to shave off 0.98% of this corporate tax cut to deliver a more generous child benefit to working class families across America. So for too many Republicans, then my argument here is that big business often takes precedence over ordinary families, or kind of a commitment to the market more generally. And we see this today with one of the more prominent Republican voices, and a likely 2024 presidential candidate, the former South Carolina governor, Nikki Haley. She is a talented, engaging, and appealing politician. She's a natural. Unfortunately, her approach to family policy is, in my view, unoriginal and off base, taken right out of the 1980s Republican playbook with no effort to kind of update her approach to help address the challenges facing families in the 21st century. In an article on family policy, for instance, in National Review, all that Haley could do was lash out at the new expanded child tax credit. She had a lot of talk about welfare and poverty in talking about this. But what Haley failed to acknowledge here was that unlike old style welfare, this new child benefit does not penalize work and marriage for poor and working class Americans. And it also helps a wide range of American families with the challenges today of affording a family in the 21st century. And in writing about family policy, Haley also displayed no recognition that the challenges we face are new ones. No recognition that too many men are idle or presumed unnecessary in America. No recognition that marriage and fertility have fallen to record lows in this country. And no recognition that her party has failed to shore up the American family in any way really beyond mere lip service. So in the face of fundamental and new challenges facing American families, the Republican Party's response has too often been, let them eat tax cuts as we throw in a little talk of family values at election time, okay? So there hasn't been enough kind of bold action on the part of Republicans from my vantage point. Now, there's no question the Democratic family agenda has been bold, particularly in this year in 2021. In a speech at Tidewater Community College, President Biden said this about his American Families Plan. It represents a once-in-a-generation investment in our families and our children that addresses what people care most about and most need. Okay, that was the claim. But when you look at the details of the programs on offer from the Democratic Party, what you often, but not always, often see is a kind of statism and workism. And what I mean by that, in terms of the idea of statism, is we're going to kind of give the state ever greater power, authority, and money to kind of shape the lives, in this case, of our young children and families. And we're also going to kind of advance an agenda that privileges work, okay, over time spent with kids. So the kind of privileges two-earner families, for instance, over single-earner families, okay? So it's kind of workist in that sense. And so this approach, from my vantage point, is devaluing the role of parents in spending time with their kids and in educating their kids. So more concretely, for instance, In the plan kind of that's being rolled out this week, the Build Back Better plan from President Biden, what we're seeing in this plan is, I think on the one hand, a laudable effort to increase the child tax credit, kind of going forward. And that kind of gives families money to spend as they see fit for their kids, as they think, best. We also see three things that leave me troubled. The first is that the child care and the EIDC plans end up penalizing marriage yet again. The second thing that gives me pause is that the universal pre-K approach is going to be extending kind of the power of the state 2 more years across kids' lives, basically to 3 and 4-year-olds, in ways that will kind of necessarily diminish the time that they spend with their families. And then also, they're going to allocate about $200 billion to subsidize childcare for middle and low-income families. And this particular approach is giving nothing to families who've got, a stay-at-home parent in this approach. So these are, I think, in different ways, both statist and workist, and also end up penalizing marriage. So this plan ignores the fact that most parents in America would prefer family care for their young kids versus daycare. So consider, for instance, Andrea Nunez, a 25-year-old mother in St. Petersburg, Florida, who relies on her mother and mother-in-law to take care of her toddler. She says, both grandmas live nearby and have taken turns caring for our daughter. It's great having someone you trust, knowing that she is going to be in good hands. Nunez preferred family care to daycare because, quote, when they're a baby, it's harder to trust a child care worker because they have other kids they're looking after, not just ours. But being with a grandparent, they'll get the attention, love, and care that a baby needs. Now, Nunez is no outlier. A majority of parents say that they prefer to have their kids at home, either cared for by parents or a family member. And only 18% of parents would prefer to have their young children in daycare or childcare on a full-time basis. So again, I don't think that the Democratic approach is really kind of attentive to the ways in which many parents across the US would prefer to have family members, be they grandparents or parents, kind of taking the lead when it comes to caring for our young children. So is there a better way forward when it comes to family policies? To kind of wrap up our conversation this morning, is there a way that kind of is dedicated to reviving the fortunes of the family by strengthening our educational, our economic, and our cultural foundations? I think there are some ideas here and some politicians here who are kind of moving us in a more constructive direction, recognizing that we should be trying to build what we could call kind of a familist policy agenda. And by familism, I mean the idea that men and women should prioritize the needs of their family over their own individual desires, and that we as a society are kind of working towards a world where parents have the money and the time they need to devote to their kids and their families more generally. One example of this kind of more familist approach has been articulated by Blake Masters in his run for the Arizona Senate. He has said that he would like to see an America where you should be able to raise a family on one single income. So kind of articulating this idea of like a family wage, for instance, as a goal that policymakers should be pursuing in the 21st century. Now, obviously, government can only do so much here, but I think there is a role for public policy when it comes to reviving the fortunes of American families. And I've got 5 ideas to conclude with as we draw to an end here. So the first idea, right, is to defund college and to refund vocational education. And the idea here, right, is that even today, and a lot of my students at UVA and probably students here kind of don't realize that even today, most young adults don't get a BA, don't get a BS, okay? They don't get a college degree. And yet the vast, vast majority of our time and attention and money in the US goes to young adults on that college track. So I think what we could do is, among other things, devote at least a third of state and federal funding that's now going to colleges and universities devote that to vocational education and to apprenticeship training. Okay, so to shift substantial focus more towards this kind of more vocational approach. And we've seen, for instance, that career academies, just kind of one way to do this in high schools across the US, have both boosted earnings and marriage rates among young men from disadvantaged backgrounds. To be kind of one example of the kind of move that we could take in the policy arena. The second thing that I think we should be thinking about is trying to figure out ways to make work pay more and to also not penalize marriage in our efforts to subsidize work. So we know that men's wages have been relatively stagnant for guys who don't have a college degree. And as we've seen also today, there also is more, there are more young men who are not stably employed. So in light of that, we could kind of reform the earned income tax credit, the EITC, into an hourly wage subsidy that would be paid out when you get your paycheck, either on a biweekly or monthly, whatever kind of basis you get it at. And this kind of wage subsidy would make work more appealing for working class Americans, and would make it easier too for them to support their families as well. And ORNCAS has a kind of model for how we can do this, if you're interested kind of in more details about this wage subsidy. The third thing would be to eliminate marriage penalties. As I mentioned, programs from Medicaid to child care subsidies often penalize marriage for working class families. We could do this by doubling the threshold for married families for these kinds of programs, and to kind of limit the financial burden this might put on the public purse. We could just hold this threshold to families with kids under the age of 5, kind of get them sort of started, if you will, and then as their kids get older, you would sort of shift the model to limit the cost of this kind of approach. The fourth thing that we could do is to extend school choice from the rich, where it now exists, to kind of all Americans, right? So we know that there are countless politicians out there, from Senators Elizabeth Warren to California Governor Gavin Newsom, who have professed support for public schools, but have sent their own kids to private schools. But many middle income and lower income Americans can't afford private schools. And this, I think, is unfortunate in part because what we see in the research that I've done, for instance, is that kids who are graduating from private schools today are more likely to forge strong and stable families, to be stably married, have their kids in marriage, et cetera. And yet again, many middle and lower income families can't afford to send their kids to private independent, Catholic, and other religious schools. And so one model here would be an educational savings account that you would give to families that would be kind of tapped up to $6,000. And those families could then spend that money on private schooling or tutoring or any other kind of legitimate educational expenses. You'd be kind of empowering families to make choices for themselves and their kids that they think best for them, and would also kind of help them, financially as well. And the fifth idea is to promote what's called the success sequence. And the idea here is that too many of our young adults today don't kind of know how to best sort of navigate the transition to adulthood, particularly around the sort of issue of kind of marriage and parenthood. They don't really kind of understand and appreciate that kids that are born in marriage are much more likely to be sort of raised in a stable family, and that their own economic prospects are much better if they follow a certain sequence. And that sequence is getting at least a high school degree, working full time, and getting married before having kids. Those 3 steps are associated with just a 3% risk of poverty for young adults today, and an 86% sort of chance of getting into the middle class or higher. Okay, so having some kind of public campaign that would educate young adults about kind of the benefits of this sequence. And we're seeing in some programs rolling out right now that young adults who've been exposed to this sort of idea are, for instance, less likely to have a baby as a teenager. So this would be kind of more of a cultural move to help young adults kind of understand and appreciate how education, work, and marriage are still connected to their ability to flourish in America today. So the bottom line here is I think we should be rejecting the kind of blind faith that some on the right have had in the market and some on the left have had in the state, that we should be thinking about educational, economic, and cultural measures to renew the foundations of family life in America, and also about policies that specifically reinforce parents' desire to and ability to invest time and money in their kids and in one another. And the alternative, of course, to taking steps like these is to accept a world where the United States devolves into a kind of separate and unequal family regime, where strong and stable families are the preserve of educated and affluent Americans, and everyone else is consigned to increasingly unstable, unhappy, and unworkable families, or today even to no family at all. I think we can all agree that this alternative here is unacceptable and un-American. So with that, I'm done, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have. Yeah, John.
Okay, so I'll start off. So I think, again, thanks for an excellent presentation. That's very good. A lot of really good things to think about. The one thing I want to just kind of challenge you a little bit.
Right, sure.
Blind faith in the market.
Right.
You talked about normalized trade relations with China at the very beginning, costing 2 million jobs. And I think I would dispute that estimate. I mean, because it's very easy to identify, like when a factory closes and that moves to China and people lose their jobs. But the thing that people don't see is that there's a lot of opportunities created by that for other people. You also highlighted, I mean, the fact that we get cheap goods, which again raises people's standards of living as well. But I just think
Right.
the important point to make is that if you look at what system worldwide has raised the most people out of poverty, is a free market system. China is a good example. So I just looked this up. 66% of Chinese people lived in extreme poverty in 1990.
Sure.
So then after that, normalized trade relations is less than 0.5%. So I mean, so it's like raised people out of poverty there. And I think it has in the United States as well. So I mean, that's one thing I was like, I mean, again,
right, sure. No, it's a good response, particularly from, I think, the Institute, right? Kind of your commitment to the market. So, I think we would agree, John, that there is no question that we have benefited financially in some ways from this different trade, trade regime that Clinton and Bush helped to inaugurate. And as I said, we do have cheaper goods kind of flowing into this country because of this agreement. The concern, though, is that, and I mean, you'd have to argue with David Autor. I'm just relying upon their numbers. They estimate that about 2 million jobs were lost from this particular trade agreement, and that it had kind of a disparate effect on communities in the Midwest and the Southeast, where a lot of manufacturing, was concentrated, that was sort of affected by this particular bill. There are also, I think, questions, right, too, about how kind of free and fair the sort of trade competition between China and the U.S. has been. So you might kind of draw different conclusions about kind of a similar agreement that if we were to make with the EU, for instance. But there are certainly kind of allegations that China has not always kind of played fair on this front. And so my concern is that I don't think the policymakers who were kind of working on this issue back in the 90s really appreciated sort of the way in which this would roll out and the effect that it would have on many working class families and communities. And even kind of if we sort of accept the sort of classical understanding of free trade, it's important to think about sort of measures to sort of like dampen the blow. And I think many folks sort of across the spectrum would acknowledge that we didn't really do a good job from a policy perspective in kind of anticipating how these jobs would disappear and what we could do to transition the people who lost their jobs into, a better economic or, an equivalently good economic position in the wake of these lost jobs. So I think even if you kind of, sort of want to sort of go for this particular free trade agreement, we could have, I think, done a better job of anticipating and helping people who are affected by it. And so I think that's one issue that, as we kind of go forward, we need to think about kind of how free trade can impact American workers. But I think also there's been, particularly actually since COVID, as like I think there's been a sort of a deep rethinking about sort of the advisability of offshoring major manufacturing, away from our shores, because you obviously lose the capacity then to do everything from, making these things in America to doing more high-tech stuff that might be actually pretty critical for our economy and even for our national security as well. So again, there are some issues that we're thinking about now in terms of free trade being not necessarily the unvarnished good that I think many folks kind of thought it was back in the late 1990s and even early 2000s. Other questions? Yes, Evan?
So it's a great presentation.
Yeah.
So we see that the decline in fertility in marriage is not only happening in Europe, like almost globally average. So I just wonder what the better about the political system in Japan.
Right.
How much it contributes to that long-term trend? And if we would like to eliminate all the issues, political issues, how we could establish the marriage and fertility?
Great question. So the question is, if you look at a lot of these trends globally, what you see is that both marriage and fertility are falling across much of the developed world in countries as different when it comes to fertility, for instance, as Sweden and Singapore. And so I think, what I talked about, I think today, that would be often applicable to many of these other contexts as well. So we are seeing in many different contexts, from the Middle East to Northern America, that surprisingly, young men are doing relatively worse in school and in college on average than young women. So that's sort of a common pattern that we would see, I think, across different national contexts. We are seeing that kind of rising real estate costs, as you know, in East Asia, in Western Canada, obviously I talked about here in the US, are presenting challenges for many working and middle-class families when it comes to kind of affording an apartment, a condo, a home. So there's a common, I think, issue there that we see maybe undergirding all this. I would also say too that, in many but not all countries with some kind of social welfare, policy regime, you do see basically marriage penalties. So we see the same thing happening in the UK, for instance. They're having a similar discussion right now about marriage penalties in the United Kingdom. And then I think the other thing that is an issue that hasn't gotten enough attention is, again, kind of the way in which I think big tech is affecting our relationships and our ability to forge kind of in-person connections. Friendships, dating, marriage, sex. I never, ever would have guessed that I would be lamenting the fact, I'm conservative, as you can guess, I'd be lamenting the fact that we're seeing teenage sex and young adult sex declining, not just in the US, but in Europe as well. And we're kind of wondering what's happening here. Well, I think part of what's happening here is that our entertainments have become so engrossing that people are just not getting out enough. And that's affecting us in a variety of ways. But I think potentially it's affecting us too in terms of people's likelihood of getting married and likelihood of having children as well. So I think there are a variety of things happening on a variety of fronts that are helping to drive marriage and fertility down across many countries, from South Korea to Singapore, Canada, the US, et cetera. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, follow up that question. I agree with you on that. When you look at a lot of developed countries that maybe such a case, but in Japan, South Korea, they try to implement Orphaned and childcare, but somehow the marriage and
Right.
fertility is still critical.
Sure. Right. Right. So there have been more deliberate family policy efforts in places like South Korea and Japan that are trying to address this issue head on by giving subsidies to parents or kind of expanding paid parental leave, for instance. I think in South Korea and Japan and East Asia more generally, I think the issue there in large part is what I would call kind of a workist corporate culture, where people are spending just tremendous hours at work. And that makes it more difficult for people to kind of devote the time that one would need to date, marry, and especially to raise kids. And so that makes, I think, it harder for people to, to sort of have confidence that they're going to have the time that they need to really kind of devote to parenting. I think that's part of the the East Asian story. Also, as you know, too, in South Korea and Japan, there are also some real estate issues too, in terms of being able to find affordable housing to, start a family in as well. I think that's also, and then also they have really high educational expenses as well. So these are all things that kind of make it less practical and more financially challenging in, for instance, South Korea and Japan to have kids, especially. So, other questions? Yes. Go ahead.
I really like the term, the electronic opioids. Do you see a connection between the gaming and this and families that are struggling to make ends meet? Is there like a vicious cycle? And then what can we do about that?
So very good question. The question is, is there a connection between kind of this idea of electronics being a kind of opioid and struggling economically? And we certainly know that sort of kind of this more extensive pattern of gaming and electronic usage seems to be focused more among young adults, young men, especially from lower income families. So I think there is some kind of connection going on there. I think there could be ways in which too, where, and I would sort of defer to Clay on this to some extent here. You might have more insight into this, but I think there's a way in which I think for some teenage boys and young men, like they might feel discouraged, in school or in the workplace, and that discouragement kind of steers them in the direction of spending more time on devices of one sort or another. And then there's a kind of vicious cycle where the more time you're on these kinds of machines, the less likely you are to be, flourishing in school or flourishing at work. So I think there could be a dynamic playing out there that's problematic. And in terms of what do we do about this, I think this is, the $60,000 question, right? So there's the more authoritarian response here we're seeing from China, where they're trying to actually limit the amount of time that teenagers are spending on gaming, for instance. They've got some kind of limit. I don't know how they're supposed to, how that works in China, but that's what they're trying to do. That, would not work here in the US. So I think the question is, can we change our norms in ways that kind of encourage parents to, have the kids, teenagers, just get outside more and, spend more time on homework as well, and really limit the amount of time their kids are on their phones and other devices. And then maybe there are ways in which lawmakers too can pursue policies in the US that kind of give parents, even adults, more power to either limit time on devices, by giving kind of, for instance, like just a universal kill switch. Like it would be nice if parents could just press a button on their iPhone and that would shut down the network in their household and shut down the family cell phone. But I mean, literally 6 o'clock, it's dinner time. We're just going to shut it all down. And I think teens would magically appear. And then also at, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night, same thing. You just press a button and the network goes down and the phones go down. And I mean, yes, you can work out systems where you're kind of monitoring your teenage daughter's phone and having her put it on the kitchen counter at, whatever, 10 o'clock. But there could be ways in which we could make the job of being a parent electronically, I think, easier. And maybe things that we could do that would make it easier for young adults who are living on their own to, rein in their use of tech as well. But you're actually the expert on this question. So maybe we'll have a session with you talking about this, about how we could practically address this challenge. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I know that Chinese government is restricting those young guys access to online gaming.
Mm-hmm.
But my concern is, isn't it a violation of human rights for them? Yeah, just look at all these students here. If your parents don't allow you guys to do online gaming, they don't use the internet, what do you think? You guys like it? Who like it? Raise your hand. Right? Nobody likes that idea. Personally, I don't agree with the Chinese government policy. I would say this should be, their decision. If they grow up, is to make their own decision. That's one. Maybe education is one way to solve this problem. I don't think government policy should Another thing is, you definitely have lots of brilliant ideas there. I learned a lot from you today, from your presentation. I love all these ideas. But my question is, we still have two parties there, Republican and Democratic.
Sure, right.
Have they heard about your voice? If they have heard of all these ideas, why they didn't take any actions to change all this? Does it mean we have to have another party, third party, take over the government? Maybe you can have one.
Sure. Well,
How to solve this
yeah,
problem?
right. So on the first point, I think we have to think about kind of freedom, and there, I mean, there's a famous essay from Isaiah Berlin talking about sort of negative and positive freedom. And I think Americans are more likely to think about sort of negative freedom in terms of like the government's not going to do X to us. And obviously there's a certain power to the liberty that we enjoy as Americans. But positive freedom, as Berlin kind of explained it, was sort of like the capacity to do things, right? And I think that what I see the problem as is that too many of our young adults, particularly our young men, are not exercising their talents to the fullest. They're too engrossed in their devices. They don't, in a sense, have the freedom, if you will, to kind of put their devices aside enough and to focus on, you know, getting an education either in high school or in college, and also to kind of really focus on developing a hobby that's non-electronic, or playing basketball or jogging, you know, in the out of doors. Or as you know, the research from this Princeton economist suggests, to be fully engaged in getting launched in their work in their 20s. So I think we have to think about a non-Chinese and non-authoritarian way of helping our young men develop the capacity to, and as someone who spends too much time on my iPhone, I'm not saying, but we all can work on ways, I think, to sort of spend less time in the electronic world and more time in the real world is the idea there. And there could be some policy interventions that would help us to do that without being as authoritarian as the Chinese have been on this question. On the broader partisan point, I think, you know, as the sort of demographic trends that I've talked about, I think are going to accelerate in the coming years in terms of marriage and fertility. I think it might create a new concern on the part of both Democrats and Republicans about what's happening, and maybe a willingness to be more creative in trying new strategies to give young adults more confidence and more resources when it comes to both putting a ring on it and having kids. But I think, well, and there actually has been some movement already, you know, where some candidates now are articulating a kind of an agenda that's more focused on making family life more affordable. So I'm hoping that trend will accelerate. Clay?
Do we have time for one more? Okay, so we have a couple questions from the online. So I'll just read one. It's very related to what you just said. If these issues are not addressed, what do you predict will be intergenerational effects in 40 to 60 years?
So the question is for for the audience, if we don't do anything, what's going to be sort of the intergenerational effect in the next 30 or 40 years? So I think the problem here, in part, is that we have seen in East Asia the emergence of what's called bare branches, and that term is describing actually in China men with no kin. But I think we're going to see kind of in America the sort of trend crossing the Pacific. And more young adults, so the students who are sitting here in this audience, we're going to see more and more of you not getting married and not having kids. And that might seem fine in your 20s, even in your 30s. But as you kind of hit midlife and later life, not having a spouse, not having children is going to be enormously consequential for you in terms of your money, your health care. Like when you're in, the hospital age 65 or something, there's no one to come like advocate for you. There's no one to kind of look after you. And there's no one to come bring you home from the hospital really and take care of you. And then also kind of just people's emotional well-being as well. We do know, for instance, the deaths of despair that have been kind of rising among working class Americans in recent years have been concentrated among Americans who are either divorced or never married. So I think the concern I have is that we are concretely estimating that about 25% of young adults today will not have kids, and about 1/3 will never marry. And I think those numbers are going to kind of grow unless we see some kind of major reversal, obviously, in terms of the trends that I've talked about today in terms of marriage and fertility. So that's the concern. There's going to be a growing number of young adults today who, as they move into midlife and later life, will not have a spouse and not have kids and be therefore without kin. That's the big concern.